Hello, welcome to the Detectives Files, True Crime Tales with Jacques Morrell. Jack spent 30 years in the police, starting out on the beat before moving into CID, where he investigated some of the most serious crimes imaginable, homicide included. In this series, he's been opening up about life in the force, why he joined, what it was like to confront death, and the realities behind the uniform. But now we're moving into darker territory, Jack's very first murder case. Just set the scene for me first of all. When was this?
This was 1989. Now, thinking back, I'd started my aid to CID in April of 1989, and I had probably just 3 years on the beat, as you say, in uniform. So I was working with a mentor during this aid period, where obviously the idea is that your mentor will give you or help show you how to investigate a range of crimes. But these are the crimes that come through the door at a subdivisional CID office. So the area we covered had a little bit of inner city, a little bit of more suburban life, and you get as much experience obviously as possible. And this case, it resonates with me, so I think it hopefully will resonate with you, was late December. It actually disrupted all the bank holidays and all the time off in December. It basically meant for probably a week, possibly more, that we were living at work basically to sort this case out. Our CRD office would have been limited staffing. It would have been fairly quiet, and then next minute the call goes in and the circus turned out for the body of a woman that was found in a lake. And this is at Colic Country Park. This is a country park that is, I think you find them all over the country, that's part of a quarry, a former quarry that's been flooded and now has become a country park. So you've got a series of lakes and there's leisure activities that go off around there.
Gravel pits and that kind of thing, which is very common in this part of Nottinghamshire because there's a lot of gravel to be mined, and that's what you get left with at the end of it is a big hole that fills with water.
It is, yeah. And what I'm saying to you now, Simon, is from my memory of my experience, because it was unusual to see the office now full of detectives who I'd never seen before, senior officers who I'd never seen before, who just descended on our quiet office as we go through that December period. So the whole place was turned upside down. And I remember as well, my old shift in uniform were on that morning when the call came in. And I think a dog walker had seen a body close to the shore of the lake, alerted the ranger. There's fishing permits that are required. There's that kind of thing going off. There's a hut where you have to, if you drive in, you need to acknowledge whether you're going fishing or not to get a permit, etc. And then the call came in, and my former colleague in uniform was the first police officer down there. And the scene of this, where this woman was at the side of a cinder car park that was quite overgrown or surrounded by bushes and undergrowth. So whilst it was at times busy, at quiet times it was quite a remote spot, if that follows.
I know the area you're describing. It's between Nottingham Racecourse, one end of Nottingham Racecourse, and then there's a pub, like an estate pub, and a crossroads. So yeah, I know exactly where we are, and I know where the car park is as well.
From memory, I think this was a Saturday, but obviously a body in a lake has to be dealt with, and they can be there for a number of reasons. But once the body of this young woman was brought out, it was clear she had extensive injuries, including defence injuries from a knife on her hands. So immediately we've got a homicide investigation. What was apparent quite quickly is that, and again I'm going from memory here, so this isn't, but from memory I seem to recall that a woman who lived locally, not that far away, in the Sneinton area of Nottingham, was reported missing, whether that was by her parents or by her husband, but that she wasn't at home from the early hours of that morning. So within a short space of time, we've identified that it's this woman that we've got. Her name was Shaheen Hussain. She was from a Pakistani Kashmiri family. Her parents lived in the area, and her relatively new, I think she was in her early 20s, and her Pakistani Kashmiri husband, who was a taxi driver, was also lived nearby to where her family were.
And just to give people an idea of the geography, Sneinton is part of Nottingham, which is maybe 1.5 miles from Colwick Park, a little closer to the city centre, a little further north of the River Trent, right?
That's exactly it, yeah.
Back-to-back houses, a nice neighbourhood, but relatively inner city and predominantly Victorian or Edwardian housing stock.
That's absolutely right, yeah. So we were fairly happy that it was this woman, and that she'd been officially reported missing by the family. I can't remember whether it was the husband or the father. So as that day progressed, we invited, obviously, the husband and the family who'd reported her missing to assist us in trying to find out what had happened. And that's where I came in. I was tasked to speak to the father of this woman in an interview room, voluntarily, to assist with the investigation, as clearly any father or husband would do if their loved one has gone missing and is believed to have been found deceased. I seem to recall that the initial explanation, or the last time she'd been seen alive, came from the husband, who had picked her up. I think she worked nearby on that Friday, and he'd picked her up and taken her home, left her at home. Taxi drivers, by the nature of their work, they're often working, particularly at weekends, they're going to be out all evening and into the small hours of the morning. And then I'm reading from memory that she was probably reported missing when he got home in the early hours of the morning. So, and I remember this quite vividly. So all the staff are starting to appear, police officers and detectives who I'd never seen before, suddenly sat in your desk where you've been working, where you've got your files and paperwork thereabouts. So it's all quite exciting, particularly at my stage of service. And I was tasked with, and I don't think it was with my tutor or my mentor, I think it was with another officer, to speak to and get the story from the father. As I've said, the husband was in actually an interview next door. I seem to think the father certainly spoke, the conversation was English, it didn't need any interpreter. But obviously there were some limitations with the conversation. And whilst I believed I was getting the truth, the conversation was somehow stunted, and it just didn't feel right that this man has been told that we believe we've found his daughter in a lake and dead. I didn't feel much emotion. Now that, you can't read too much into that.
But somehow What are you saying? He wasn't as surprised as you expected him to be? He wasn't as shocked as you expected him to be? Almost as though he was expecting it, almost though he knew it had happened already. Is that what we're saying?
I don't think it went to that level, but I was just, and again, it's really more what he said than his emotional reaction, because that can be different. We can all be different. But I just felt that he probably had an idea of what had happened or who was behind this, but for whatever reason wasn't at that point willing to spill the beans.
I see.
In the meantime, I can hear my colleagues speaking to the husband next door, and that conversation is becoming more heated, shall we say. Now, these are the days when conversations were more heated, they were more direct, and if you're speaking to somebody in whatever circumstances, there might be a degree of manipulation and some pretty straight talking. And they were clearly having a very straight talking conversation.
Robust interviewing
techniques.
A
robust interview, yeah. My interview with the father didn't need to be robust, but clearly the father was hearing what was going on next door. And that was quite probably deliberate to have those two interviews next door, because of the impact. What's one saying? What's the other saying? Et
so the fact you could overhear what was happening in the other interview room, that was tactical.
Yeah, you could hear. Yeah, the raised voices were clearly coming in, and we would pause and allow that disturbing shouting next door to manifest itself. So that was interesting. It was hard work, and I remember going back into the incident room for the late night briefing. You might be up to probably midnight now, before everyone sort of goes home for a few hours sleep, and sort of debriefing this.
How long was it before you made an arrest?
Right. It would have been within a day or so, I think. Ultimately, we concluded that the husband, we didn't believe him, that we suspected him of having an affair with a local woman outside of his community, and all the sort of motivations of a marriage that was failing, quite estranged. And I've always noticed this with taxi drivers, by the nature of their work, they're living sometimes quite you can imagine a young marriage, and you've got the wife at home, although she was working during the day, and then he's going out all night. So within a fairly short time, and again, I'm only going from my memory here, I'm not picking up any court report or anything like that. Not only was the husband arrested, but he confessed, strangely enough, unusually enough, to what he'd done. And I'm not sure exactly how that interview progressed to get that confession or what was happening. However, what he'd done was, having decided that for whatever reason he wanted rid of his wife, he'd recruited some individuals to commit the murder. And what he'd actually done was he'd picked his wife up from work that Friday evening, driven to the location of the car park that I've described in what would now be, in darkness, it would be accessible, but a secluded, dark car park. And he deliberately got her out of the vehicle and then driven off, leaving her at the mercy of at least two men who'd then gone about to kill her and leave her body in the lake.
So he commissioned the killing, he commissioned the murder, but two other people committed the murder?
At least from memory. There were two, I know there were two men also charged with the murder, and convicted. I mean, the interesting thing for me was that I've seen a very slight report that talks about one of these convicted men who did, I think, 16 years of a life sentence and then was released. And there's a report from another regional newspaper that talks about a contract killing, which again, from journalistic point of view, if somebody's hired or arranged the killing of another person, it is a contract. But this was more of an agreement and a promise of some money to street people, down and out street drinkers. Because when this revelation came from the husband, we then had to go and find these street people, and we found them in a day centre for rough sleepers, one of these dry centres where you're only allowed in when you're sober, and they get a meal, they'll get a warm, they might get a change of clothes, new pair of socks, that kind of thing. And this facility still exists in Nottingham, as in any major city. And I recall that we went mob-handed and we virtually arrested half a dozen, if not more, of these individuals. They were all there 2 days after the murder, getting their cup of tea and a bit of breakfast, and we cleared the place out and obviously then had to process these people.
What was the consequence for Mohammed Afsar, for the husband? What happened to him?
Well, he was charged. He was. I would think they were all charged. Say him and the two, because the two people who were charged certainly admitted to what they did. And this is another unusual facet. You think, if I said to you, this is the scenario, this is what happened in truth, do you think any of those people would confess to what had gone off? And I think your answer and my answer would be, well, probably not. You know, you deny everything until the evidence is laid before you in court. But yeah, oddly, they were sort of happy to explain what they've done, which is probably the most bizarre thing about it. You know,
even though he wasn't confronted with evidence, when he was confronted by your colleague in the interview room, shall we say, he found himself compelled to confess.
Yeah, whether he'd felt some remorse, whether this arrangement had taken place. I mean, what was clear, I think they'd been given something like 50 quid and a bottle of brandy or something like that as a down payment. Do the job and you'll get lots more from the insurance payout. It was probably almost an idea, a conversation, a recklessly awful suggestion that went horribly wrong because these people went through with it. And I think probably all realised, well, this has gone horribly wrong. You know, let's just, this shouldn't have happened. Let's confess all. And that's what they did. And it got them all life sentences.
It did get two people off the street as well, didn't it? It gave them a permanent roof over their head, in a way. Not that you would wish to find accommodation in those circumstances, but if you're a street drinker and you're living in hostels and sleeping rough, the prospect of a prison cell and regular meals and reasonable heating is perhaps quite attractive in the circumstances.
Yeah, I hear that, Simon, and I seem to recall that one of them was from a good family background, and his parents or his father was quite influential in local government or business, something like that. So it was a surprise package that he drifted into this street drinking life, and then bizarrely taken this offer of of money up front, a little bit of money up front, to commit a heinous act of murder, to kill a woman in cold blood in such an awful way is. And again, we talk about the victims, don't we? Shaheen, 20-year-old woman in the 20s, is recently married. I think she was probably raised in the UK, or certainly for some time. She was a working woman, she was a young woman with a life ahead of her. And to be taken out in that circumstances was awful. But from my memory of those days over Christmas, obviously my Christmas was cancelled. I didn't see my friends, my family for those days. We got the job done. I met new colleagues. I saw how different colleagues operate and conduct themselves, and it's all part of that learning process, which stays with you. I know my detail here is not that strong, but the memory is strong, and the experience. People will go into different walks of life, whatever they do, and those early experiences of colleagues that you like the way they operate, or colleagues that you think, I don't like them, I don't like their attitude, and you start to form, you're learning your skills on the hoof.
The overall impression is what counts, isn't it? That's what lingers.
Yeah.
If there's one thing that you take away from this experience, your first murder investigation, what would it be?
I think my real one thing I take from that is how, at the time, you guys in the media would say, murder squad detectives investigating a body in the lake. There wasn't any such thing as a murder squad. That team of officers happened to be the ones who were on duty, happened to be linked to the senior officer who initially was given the role. And sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. The dynamic can be awkward. They might be bringing in staff that they want to work with because they know how they work, but equally, they didn't know how we worked. So when I left the job and finished my career, we got more structure to squads. We had a murder squad. We had a domestic violence squad. We had a child abuse squad that specialised and had strong responsibility and expertise. In those days, it was, people used to say, let's open another box of detectives and just bring a load more in and work through it. So that's probably the take-home thing. Plus obviously, that early days of that sometimes people do admit to the most heinous things imaginable. Which gives us all hope that we will get the truth somewhere.
I don't like the way you're looking at me. Jacques Morrell, thanks so much again for that. We're loving the Detectives Files, true crime tales with your good self, the man I call the Governor. Thanks so much. More next time.